Last week, I was stuck in a terminal at Miami International during one of those indefinite delays that turns a crowded concourse into a weary refugee camp. Right next to the gate, where a 737 sat with its engine cowling open and a maintenance crew looking genuinely baffled, was a massive, high-definition digital billboard. It wasn't showing flight updates. Instead, it was a loop of a beautifully produced corporate video featuring the airline's Regional Equity Task Force smiling in a sun-drenched, glass-walled office. The contrast was almost hallucinatory. On the tarmac, the Caribbean airspace was effectively shutting down because there weren't enough air traffic controllers to staff the desks. But on the screen, a vice president was passionately explaining how the company had redefined the horizon of institutional belonging. I ended up sharing a lackluster airport coffee with a guy sitting on his suitcase, a retired FAA inspector who had spent 30 years in the guts of the system. He wasn't shouting or venting, he just had this look of profound, quiet exhaustion. He nodded toward the glossy billboard and said something that stuck with me. In my day, if the planes didn't move, someone was fired. Today, as long as the progress report looks like that, the planes are secondary. That moment of realization was chilling. It felt like watching a glitch in the Matrix, a total decoupling of the image of a service from the actual physical reality of it. The chaos wasn't a temporary technical failure or a budget shortfall. It was a symptom of a much deeper systemic shift. We've entered an era where the people managing our most critical infrastructure seem to have forgotten that their primary job is to keep things from falling out of the sky. We're currently testing a very dangerous hypothesis. Whether a civilization built on the rigors of engineering can survive when it decides that physics is just another perspective to be managed.
And that hypothesis is really, it's the central question for our entire deep dive today, isn't it? This idea that you can manage reality with language.
Exactly. It's not just a one-off story from an airport. That moment felt like, a perfect snapshot of a much bigger problem, a problem we're seeing pop up everywhere.
It's a measurable decay. I mean, we can see it in the data from safety protocols at federal agencies all the way to university budgets. It's this growing gap between the image and the actual function.
Right, because when something big goes wrong, like, a door plug blows off a plane mid-flight, everyone immediately looks for the one broken part. The one loose bolt.
The immediate physical cause.
But that retired inspector, he wasn't looking at the engine. He was looking at the billboard. He was pointing to the operating system of the whole institution.
The culture.
Yeah, the invisible logic underneath it all. And the shift from a logic of pure competence, where the only question that matters is, does it work, to this new logic.
The logic of bureaucracy and an ideology where the main question seems to be, does it look good on a progress report?
Competence versus optics.
Or to be a bit more technical, it's the clash between the demands of physics in what we call a high reliability organization and the social demands of a political bureaucracy.
Okay, our high reliability organizations. Because if there's one place where physics absolutely has to win over ideology, it's air traffic control.
You can't debate gravity at 30,000 feet.
No, gravity doesn't care about your perspective. So we've got this story, this firsthand account from a veteran radar technician. This guy has been working at a major Midwest hub for, decades, staring at that screen. And he talks about the people who used to get that job. He calls them the gods of the scope. And he said getting that job was like going through this brutal cognitive gauntlet.
Right.
It wasn't about your background. It wasn't about anything other than this one specific mental trait he calls the spatial twitch.
The spatial twitch, it's so descriptive.
It's this ability to solve four-dimensional puzzles in your head in real time, to see where two planes going 500 knots are going to be in 20 seconds while you're talking to three other pilots. He says it's this freakishly rare skill.
And that skill, that twitch, is the bedrock of the entire air safety system. It's the fundamental asset.
But he describes a change. He talks about watching this new recruit come through the training pipeline who just didn't have it. Yeah. This person, he said, completely lacked the basic stress tolerance for a heavy shift. When bad weather rolls in and the whole sky just gets crowded and chaotic.
When the system is under maximum load.
Exactly. And he said in the old days, that trainee would have washed out on day one. But this time was different. The trainee was pushed through.
Why?
Because the facility managers were under immense pressure from upstairs not to let a diversity metric fail. So they made a trade. They traded that invisible safety margin, the buffer between those two little blips on the screen, for a clean HR report.
And that's the core of it right there. The technician's fear isn't about the identity of the person in the chair.
Oh.
It's the realization that the system itself, the very wall that's supposed to hold back chaos, is being systematically dismantled from the inside for reasons that have nothing to do with safety.
Yeah. So to really understand why that's so catastrophic, we have to dig into that term you used, an HRO, a high reliability organization. What exactly is that?
It's a very specific term in organizational theory. An HRO isn't just, a company that tries to do a good job. It's an organization where failure is completely unacceptable because it leads to immediate catastrophe. Think of a nuclear power plant, the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, a chemical processing facility, and of course, air traffic control.
Right. And that distinction is critical. Because look, if I work at a marketing firm and I hire someone who isn't a great copywriter because I need to hit a diversity quota, what's the actual worst case scenario?
You lose a client. You have a bad quarter. The company might lose some money.
But nobody dies.
In a normal organization, you have the luxury of optimizing for secondary goals like social equity or corporate image because the cost of failure is mostly financial. In an HRO, the cost of failure is existential.
So how do they maintain that safety record for so long?
Historically, HROs stayed safe by being, frankly, ruthlessly exclusionary. They designed brutal filtering mechanisms to find very specific cognitive aptitudes like that spatial twitch, and they actively ignored everything else.
A meritocracy of survival.
What that radar technician is describing is the fundamental transformation of an HRO into a standard political bureaucracy. It's a process of institutional capture where the HR department moves from a support role, making sure paychecks go out, to becoming the vanguard of operational strategy.
I do want to push back here for a moment just to play devil's advocate, because the argument you always hear is that the old meritocracy was just a cover for privilege, that the old tests were culturally biased and they were filtering out perfectly qualified people who just didn't happen to look like the old guard. Right? That led to the big change at the FAA in 2013. This is the hiring scandal that's all over the policy briefs. Can you walk us through what they actually did?
Absolutely. So before 2013, the main pipeline to becoming a controller was something called the CTI, the Collegiate Training Initiative.
Okay, so a specific college program.
Right. You'd go to an FAA-approved university, you'd study aviation, learn all the systems, the vocabulary.
The aptitude test.
The air traffic selection and training test. It was an 8-hour computer-based monster. It measured things like numerical reasoning, spatial visualization, reaction time under stress. It was incredibly hard. It was designed to be hard.
So you had a pipeline of candidates who had already proven their dedication. They'd spent years of their lives and, tens of thousands of dollars specifically training for this one job.
They had skin in the game. But the demographic output of that CTI pipeline did not mirror the demographics of the general population.
And the administration at the time saw that as a problem.
They saw that discrepancy as de facto evidence of a systemic barrier. So instead of, say, doing the long, hard work of building up interest in aviation in underrepresented communities, which is a generational project, they opted for a shortcut. They decided to change the filter.
Okay, so what did that look like in practice?
In 2013, they essentially threw out the CTI program as the primary path. They opened up hiring to the general public, what they called an off-the-street bid, and they completely scrapped the ATSD, that 8-hour cognitive test.
And they replaced it with?
A biographical questionnaire.
A biographical questionnaire. I've seen some of the descriptions of this. It sounds less like a technical exam and, more like a BuzzFeed personality quiz.
It was arguably worse than that, because when the scoring methodology was finally revealed during the subsequent investigations and lawsuits, it showed that the test was actively designed to penalize traditional indicators of competence.
What does that mean? Penalize competence.
Okay, so for example, there were questions about your grades in high school. If you answered that you got high grades in subjects like science or history, the scoring algorithm marked you down. It gave you a lower score.
How can getting good grades in science be a negative for a job that is literally applied physics and real-time calculation?
Right.
What was the rationale?
The justification, and you have to perform some serious mental gymnastics to follow it, was that they wanted to identify raw aptitude that was completely independent of what they saw as privilege.
So the logic was, If you had good science grades, you might have just gone to a good school.
They saw high achievement as potential evidence of a privileged background. So they treated those traditional markers of competence and diligence as statistical noise that needed to be filtered out in order to find these supposed hidden gems who had the aptitude but never had the opportunity.
That seems like an absolutely insane gamble to take with the safety of the flying public. You're basically betting that a personality test can magically find a hidden air traffic controller better than a specific university degree and a validated 8-hour cognitive exam.
It was a massive gamble. Then the corruption started.
Right.
The test wasn't just scientifically dubious, it was actively compromised. This is where the NBC FAA scandal comes in. That's the National Black Coalition of Federal Aviation Employees.
Okay.
Internal investigations, which were later backed up by whistleblowers, revealed that certain members of this group within the FAA itself were given the correct answers to the biographical questionnaire to distribute to their preferred candidate. Oh, there is a recorded voicemail, it's public record now, from an FAA employee named Shelton Snow, literally telling a candidate, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm sending you the screenshots, this is how you have to answer to get through the system.
Great.
Yeah.
You have a meritocratic pipeline that's been proven to work for decades. You sever it. You replace the difficult cognitive test with a personality quiz that actively penalizes academic achievement. And then a specific ideological group inside the agency gets caught feeding the answers to their friends.
That is the textbook definition of institutional capture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did it actually matter? Did planes start falling out of the sky in 2014? Because the defenders of this policy will come back and say, look, the systems are safe, the system is still running, you're just fear-mongering.
And that is the billion-dollar question, right? Did this decoupling of the hiring process from competence actually lead to planes, decoupling from the sky?
Yeah.
So the everything policy brief we looked at actually analyzed the safety data from that period. No. We did not see an immediate catastrophic spike in hull losses. Planes did not start raining from the sky in 2014.
So there was enough redundancy built into the system to absorb that initial shock.
Yes. You have to remember, the commercial aviation system is probably the most robust, safety-obsessed system human beings have ever created. It takes a lot to break it all at once. The data does show a troubling trend. In the years following that change, the steady decline in near-mid-air collisions and runway incursions. It stopped. It plateaued, and then it started to tick slightly upward.
Now, the FAA would probably argue that's due to more traffic, more drones in the airspace.
And that's a fair counter-argument to consider. It's not a simple one-to-one correlation. What was the stated goal of the program in the first place?
To increase diversity.
Did this massive disruptive change actually achieve its primary objective?
The numbers in the report on that are pretty stark.
It was a complete failure. The percentage of female controllers, for example, barely budged. It was stuck between 16 and 18% before the change, and it was stuck there after the change. The policy didn't move the needle at all.
Here, on one side of the ledger, you destroyed the trust of an entire collegiate training pipeline. You alienated a whole generation of qualified, motivated candidates. You implemented a hiring system that is demonstrably less rigorous and was actively corrupted. You damaged the safety culture of the entire organization.
And on the other side of the ledger?
Nothing. You didn't even achieve the diversity goals that you used as a justification for blowing the whole thing up.
It's the ultimate lose-lose scenario, and it's driven by a bureaucracy that became obsessed with the process of equity rather than the outcome of competence.
And this gets us back to that hollowed-out state the old radar technician was talking about. Because the old guard, the gods of the scope, they're all retiring now. They're leaving. And the people who were replacing them were selected using this deeply compromised mechanism.
We haven't paid the full invoice for that decision yet. That's the terrifying thing about institutional decay. There's a lag time. You can coast on the fumes of past competence for a surprisingly long time. The Roman aqueducts didn't all break on the same day. The empire rotted for a century.
Right. And the danger is that by the time the cracks become undeniable, by the time you have that big catastrophic failure, the institutional knowledge you need to even begin to fix the problem is already gone. The people who knew how it was built are retired. But this isn't just an FAA story, is it? I mean, the FAA is maybe the most dramatic example, but this pattern of process over product, it feels like it's everywhere. Every institution you interact with, it just feels heavier, slower, less capable, even while their headcount is going up.
It's a paradox, isn't it? More people, less output.
Yeah. And that brings us to the second story in our stack today, which I think illustrates the actual physics of this problem perfectly.
The leak from the admin floor.
Yes. This is from a senior engineer at a federal aviation facility. 30 years in the trenches, keeping instrument landing systems, the ILS, running.
So the systems that guide a plane down to the runway when the pilot can't see a thing?
If the ILS fails, the airport shuts down. It's that critical. And he breaks down his own budget for us.
No.
He says he is spending 60%, 60 of his weekly budget, not on wires, not on antennas, not on backup hardware.
Where is it going?
It's going to pay the salaries of climate equity liaisons and institutional inclusion analysts.
Roles that have zero physical interaction with the reality of keeping a plane safely in the air?
Zero. He describes a facility where the backup power generators for the entire airport are literally corroding from neglect because of so-called budgetary constraints, while at the same time, the administrative wing of the building is getting a brand new renovation to house this ever-growing army of compliance officers.
That's the decoupling from an intro in physical form.
It's what he calls functional paralysis. The organization has inverted itself. Its primary mission is no longer guiding planes. Its mission has become sustaining the bureaucracy that manages the people who are supposed to be talking about the planes.
And this is where we have to bring in the science. Because what you just described isn't just a case of bad management or misplaced priorities. It is a predictable, almost physical outcome of how complex systems scale.
Okay.
We have a paper from the physics preprint server, our KEF, called How Much Regulation Do We Need from Genomes to Society? And it uses biology as a perfect analogy for why this happens.
So it compares an organization to a living organism. Walk us through the bacteria versus the mammal analogy.
Okay, so think about a single-celled bacterium. It's tiny. And inside its chemistry is what a physicist would call well-mixed.
Well-mixed.
It means all the proteins, all the chemicals, they're just floating around in a single soup. Anything can interact with anything else. There are no departments. There are no cubicle walls.
Total open plan office, transparency.
And total chaos. Because every component has to be able to interact with every other component. The cost of regulation, which is the energy the cell has to spend just to manage all those interactions, it scales super linearly.
Okay, superlinear is a technical term. It means if you double the size.
You more than double the cost. The number of potential interactions explodes exponentially. And this puts a hard physical limit on how big a bacterium can possibly get. If it grew too big, it would spend 100% of its energy just managing its own internal chaos, and it would literally smash to death.
That's why we don't see bacteria the size of golden retrievers.
The physics won't allow it. So how do you solve this problem? How do you get big and complex like a human being or a Fortune 500 company without collapsing under your own weight?
You have to specialize.
You evolve. You become a eukaryote. You build internal walls. You create compartments. You create modules.
Right. A liver cell does liver things. A brain cell does brain things. And the liver cell doesn't need to have a meeting with the brain cell every time it processes a toxin.
Perfect. That modularity is the key to efficiency. It allows for what the paper calls sublinear scaling. The bigger and more modular you get, the more efficient you become per unit of mass.
Okay, so modularity is good. It saves energy.
It's the only way to build a complex system that works. But, and this is the absolute crucial insight from the paper for what we're talking about today, what we are witnessing in our institutions, like the FAA, like our universities, is a deliberate breakdown of that module. We are reintroducing functional diversity into every single module. It looks exactly like the story of the engineer you just told. In the past, the engineering module just had one job, engineering. It was brutally efficient. Now, that same engineering module is also responsible for climate equity, social outreach, institutional belonging reporting, and a dozen other compliance tasks.
So you've forced the liver to also try to be the brain and the pancreas and the spleen.
You have reintroduced the well-mixed state of the bacterium. Now, the engineer cannot just go fix the corroding generator. First, he has to interface with the climate liaison. He has to file the equity impact report. The number of internal interactions skyrockets. The regulatory cost goes super linear again.
And the energy of the organization, a budget, gets diverted away from the actual physical output, fixing the generator, and into managing this new self-created internal friction.
The meetings and the reports are literally consuming the energy that's supposed to be maintaining the hardware.
Which perfectly explains this idea of the administrative parasite. It's not that the people in these compliance roles are malicious or evil. It's that the organizational structure now demands that they exist. And it demands that they consume the budget simply to manage the complexity that their own roles created in the first place.
And we see the data on this most clearly when we look at universities. There's a paper from UConn called Promissory Education, and it has a statistic in it that is just staggering. In American universities today, there are now, on average, 2 full-time administrators for every 1 tenure-track faculty member.
And 2. 2 bureaucrats for every 1 person who is actually doing the core mission of teaching and research.
2 to 1. The energy required to support those 2 administrators, their salaries, their benefits, their offices, their pensions, it all has to come from somewhere.
It comes from tuition hikes and letting the chemistry building fall apart.
Exactly. The paper calls it the trade-off between deferred maintenance and amenities. Universities are spending fortunes building climbing walls and lazy rivers to attract students, which is a marketing function, while the actual usable academic space, the labs and classrooms, are literally deteriorating.
The lazy river is the university's version of the climate equity liaison. It's a visible surface-level feature meant to signal a certain kind of value, while the core infrastructure just quietly rots away.
The paper calls this bureaucratic entropy, and it identifies this one brilliant mechanism for how it happens called obsolete processes. So imagine a new vice president of student experience is hired. To justify her salary, she creates a new initiative, let's say a student wellness daily tracking form. She hires a staff of 3 people to manage it. 10 years go by. That VP is long gone. The problem that form was supposed to solve may not even exist anymore. But does the form go away? The form remains, the staff remains, the committee that oversees the form remains. It becomes institutional scar tissue.
And then the new VP comes in, and they can't fire the old staff because that's politically messy. So they just add a new layer on top, the Digital Wellness and Mindful Engagement Initiative.
And the layers just accumulate. The entropy, the disorder always increases. And the amount of energy available for the actual mission teaching physics or flying planes gets closer and closer to zero.
Sure. We have the FAA scandal, the specific policy change. We have the physics of this superlinear bureaucratic scaling. But we still need to answer the why. Why did the people in charge let this happen? Why does a CEO or an agency director watch the generators corrode while they approve the budget for a new digital billboard?
This is the hardest part of the puzzle, and it's the most human. It's not because they're stupid, it's because the incentive structure is completely decoupled from physical risk.
That brings us to the sociology of it.
Exactly. This brings us to the sociology of the elite.
And we have a concept for this from the source material. It's called luxury beliefs. And this ties directly into our third story, which is all about the gap between the boardroom and the cockpit.
Right.
The narrator asks you to picture this high-ranking manager in Washington, D.C. This person gives speeches championing the new hiring standards. They talk about how the old cognitive tests were exclusionary and how the new biographical questionnaires are holistic and progressive.
To them, these ideas are a status symbol.
They're a luxury item, like a designer handbag or an expensive car. It signals their virtue and their membership in the elite class.
The sociologist Rob Henderson, who coined the term, defines a luxury belief as an idea or an opinion that confers status on the upper class while inflicting costs on the lower classes.
And in this context, the upper class is the administrative elite, the managers, and the lower class is the operational class.
The pilots, the mechanics, the controllers on the floor, and ultimately the passengers on the plane.
Right. The executive in D.C. gets to feel morally superior. They get invited to the right conferences. They win the Diversity and Inclusion Champion of the Year award. But here's the absolute key to the whole thing: the asymmetry of risk.
The executive isn't in the tower during a thunderstorm.
If the air traffic control system becomes 10% less reliable or 5% less efficient, the executive doesn't feel that. They fly private, or at worst, their flight is delayed and they wait it out in the VIP lounge. If, God forbid, a plane has a major incident, it's a terrible tragedy, but the executive doesn't lose their job. They certainly don't die.
The risk is completely externalized. It's pushed down the chain.
But the pilot feels it. The controller feels it immediately. The story mentions the pilot noticing that slight waver in a controller's voice, the sweat on their own palms. For the people on the front lines, the lowered standard isn't a sociological victory. It is a direct, lethal threat.
This is a concept Nassim Taleb writes about extensively. It's skin in the game. In a healthy system, especially in HRO, the feedback loops are brutally tight and direct. In the early days of aviation, if you ran an airline and you made bad decisions and your planes crashed, you went bankrupt. If you were the chief test pilot and you approved an unsafe plane, You died in it.
The retired inspector from the intro nailed it. In my day, if the planes didn't move, someone was fired. That's skin in the game.
That's skin in the game. Today, that feedback loop is gone. For the elite manager, the billboard is the reality. The progress report is the product. As long as the image of the organization is progressive and inclusive, the stock price stays up, the federal funding keeps flowing, and their career advances.
And the actual physical reality, the engine with the open cowling on the tarmac, that's just an operational detail. It's hidden behind the security fence.
And this creates a very perverse incentive structure, which one of our sources calls the tyranny of the mediocre.
Yeah, intuitive. Why would anyone want mediocrity?
Well, think about it from the perspective of a mid-level bureaucrat whose entire job revolves around compliance, paperwork, and process. Do you actually want your organization to be filled with high aptitude, eccentric, brilliant engineers?
Not. They'd be a nightmare to manage.
They'd be a complete nightmare. Highly competent people are difficult. They ask why. They point out when a new policy is nonsensical. They care more about the physical reality of their job than they do about your paperwork. If you are an inclusion analyst, a brilliant, grumpy engineer who refuses to fill out your mandatory wellness forms is a threat to your authority.
So the system begins to naturally select against demonstrated excellence.
It selects for compliance. It promotes the people who are good at being bureaucrats, not the people who are good at the core mission. The paperclip maximizer thought experiment is perfect here.
Right, the AI that's told to make paperclips.
You tell an AI, your only goal is to make as many paperclips as possible. Left unchecked, it will eventually turn the entire mass of the universe into paperclips, destroying humanity in the process because it's just following its prime directive.
And the bureaucracy's prime directive is its own survival and growth.
If you tell a bureaucracy to optimize for the process of equity reporting, it will metabolize the entire organization, the budget, the time, the talent to produce more and better reports, even if it means the planes literally stop flying. It's a closed loop where the map has become infinitely more important than the territory.
Okay, so let's try to pull all three of these threads together. Because this is a complex system-wide failure, but it seems to have these three distinct interlocking parts.
You can almost think of it as a three-stage disease infecting the institution.
Okay, stage one. Stage one is the shift from merit. That's the FAA hiring scandal. We took the cognitive filters that were specifically designed to keep high-reliability organizations safe, and we deliberately dismantled them for political reasons.
We threw out the spatial twitch test. We severed the connection between proven aptitude and the job.
Okay. Stage two?
Stage two is the administrative bloat. We allowed the bureaucratic layer to metastasize by injecting functional diversity into every part of the organization.
Forcing the engineering department to also be the social justice department.
Which drove the regulatory costs superlinear and sucked all the oxygen, all the money out of the core maintenance budget. We starved the muscle to feed the fat.
Stage three is the sociology of the elite, the luxury beliefs. The people at the very top who are making these decisions are completely insulated from the physical consequences. In fact, they are socially and financially rewarded for promoting these destructive policies, while the operational class and the public bear all of the risk.
And when you put those three stages together, what do you get?
You get functional paralysis. You get the scene at the Miami airport, a civilization that is incredibly sophisticated at producing a beautiful video about its corporate values, but is starting to forget how to manufacture a door plug that stays on a plane.
And one of our sources, The Descent of Consensus, frames this in a really profound, almost philosophical way. It argues that civilization itself is built on a foundation of unspoken agreement about objective reality.
That 2 + 2 = 4. That steel weakens under stress. That gravity is not just a suggestion.
And what we are currently engaged in is what it calls a campaign of semantic subversion. We're trying to redefine words at the bureaucratic level. Safety no longer means the physical absence of accidents. In many of these HR documents, it's been redefined to mean psychological safety or a feeling of belonging.
And excellence no longer means world-class technical mastery. It means achieving perfect demographic representation.
But the problem, the fundamental, inescapable problem, is that the physical world does not speak that language.
Right. You can redefine the word gravity in a PowerPoint presentation for an all-hands meeting, but you cannot redefine its effects on the flight deck at 30,000 feet.
And that's the collision we're seeing. It's a head-on crash between the worldview of social engineering and the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics.
And as we said at the very beginning, physics always gets the last vote. It's a very dangerous hypothesis we're testing here as a society. Can a complex technological civilization survive if it decides that competence is optional?
The entire history of failed civilizations would suggest that the answer is a resounding no. When the administrative burden of a system exceeds its productive capacity, and when its elite class becomes completely detached from the physical reality their decisions create, that system becomes brittle. It loses its resilience, its ability to adapt.
It becomes susceptible to, what's a polite engineering term? Rapid, unplanned disassembly.
That's a very polite way of saying collapse. Yeah. But I think it's important to stress this isn't some mysterious, unknowable curse. It is a structural problem with identifiable mechanisms.
We know the physics. We know that reintroducing that well-mixed chaos into modular systems is catastrophically inefficient. So the path back is to restore that modularity.
Let the engineers do engineering. Let the FAA focus on keeping planes from hitting each other. Let universities focus on education and research. Strip away the mandatory functional diversity that's choking them.
And you have to restore skin in the game. You have to find a way to make sure that the people writing the rules are the first ones to feel the pain if those rules turn out to be wrong.
You have to recouple the billboard to the engine.
We've covered a huge amount of ground today, from the green glow of radar scopes in the Midwest to the physics of single-celled organisms, all the way to the sociology of the DC boardroom. But I honestly think it might be the most important conversation we could possibly be having right now. Because at the end of the day, sooner or later, we all have to get on the plane.
We all have a non-negotiable stake in reality winning this argument.
It's from the end of one of our source materials, and it sums up this entire situation with a clarity that I find both terrifying and absolutely necessary.
We are watching a collision between a worldview that believes reality can be managed by language and a reality that is indifferent to our definitions. The falling door plug, the congested airway, the canceled NOTAM, these are not mysteries, they are invoices. They are presented by reality for a debt incurred by a civilization that chose to sacrifice competence at the altar of ideology. The question isn't whether the invoice will be paid. The question is, who pays it? The executive in the glass office or you sitting on the tarmac?
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
Stay safe out there.